I bought my daughter a $350,000 house, and 2 years later, I found her crying on the sidewalk outside it, pregnant, homeless, while my son-in-law and his entire freeloading family celebrated inside, toasting to finally getting rid of her. My name is Margaret Sullivan. I'm 74 years old, and I spent 43 years as a certified public accountant before I retired. For decades, managing other people's money teaches you something crucial. Always protect your assets, and always protect your family. My husband Thomas, God rest his soul, he's been gone 10 years now, used to tell me every single day, "Maggie, whatever happens, protect Emma. She's got too good a heart for this world." So when my daughter got married 3 years ago, I did exactly what Thomas would have wanted. I bought her that beautiful house in Nashville as a wedding gift. 3 bedrooms, renovated kitchen, good neighborhood, the works. But here's what my son-in-law Kevin didn't know, what he completely overlooked in his arrogance. I put that deed exclusively in Emma's name, not joint, not marital property, just hers. Kevin was furious when he found out. He had the nerve to ask me why I didn't trust him enough to put his name on it too. I looked him straight in the eye and told him it was a gift from my daughter, and if their marriage lasted forever, what difference would it make whose name was on the paper? Now, sitting here 74 years into this life, I'm about to tell you exactly what difference it made. Because when I pulled up to that house last Thursday afternoon and saw my pregnant daughter sitting on the curb with 2 small suitcases, sobbing like her heart was broken, while Kevin and 7 members of his parasitic family laughed and drank inside the home, I purchased well. They all forgot one very important detail. I didn't just buy that house. I knew every single property law in the state of Tennessee. And I was about to remind them that stealing from a forensic accountant's daughter comes with devastating consequences. If you've ever been underestimated because of your age, ever had someone assume you're too old to fight back, stay with me. This story is going to show you exactly what 7 decades of experience can do when you've finally had enough. Hit that subscribe button, because by the time I'm done, you'll understand why being a 74-year-old grandmother made me more dangerous to those thieves than they could ever imagine. The first time I noticed something was wrong was about 8 months after the wedding. Emma called me on a Tuesday evening, and I could hear it in her voice, that tight, controlled tone she uses when she's trying not to cry. She told me Kevin's mother, Linda, had come to visit for what was supposed to be 2 weeks, but those 2 weeks had somehow stretched into 4 months. I remember sitting in my kitchen, the same kitchen where Thomas and I raised Emma, and feeling that familiar prickle at the back of my neck. 43 years as an accountant teaches you to spot irregularities, patterns that don't add up. I asked Emma how Linda was contributing to the household, and there was this long pause before my daughter admitted that Linda wasn't paying for anything. Not groceries, not utilities, nothing. She was just there, treating my daughter's home like a hotel. But Emma kept insisting it was fine, that Kevin said his mother needed them, that she was being selfish for even thinking about asking Linda to contribute. I could hear Kevin coaching her in the background, telling her what to say. At 74, you develop an ear for these things, the way someone's voice changes when they're repeating words that aren't their own. I let it go that time. Told myself maybe I was being overprotective, that maybe this was just normal marriage adjustment. Thomas always said I could be too suspicious, that my forensic accounting brain saw fraud in every shadow. But 6 weeks later, Emma called again. This time she told me Kevin's brother Tyler had moved into the basement. Another family member, another mouth to feed, another person living rent-free in the house I purchased for my daughter. Tyler was supposedly between jobs, supposedly just needed a few weeks to get back on his feet. Emma explained that Kevin insisted family helps family, that she was being cold-hearted for suggesting Tyler should pay even minimal rent. She told me Tyler ate everything she bought for the week in 2 days, that he left the basement looking like a disaster zone, that he played video games until 3 in the morning while she tried to sleep for work the next day. I drove to Nashville that weekend. Just showed up, told Emma I wanted to take her to lunch. When I walked into that house, my house, the one I'd purchased with money I'd saved for decades, I saw Linda sprawled across the living room sofa I'd bought for Emma, watching television at full volume. Tyler was in the kitchen making himself an enormous sandwich, with what looked like an entire package of deli meat. Neither of them acknowledged me when I walked in. Didn't say hello, didn't thank me for the home they were living in rent-free. Nothing. Emma looked exhausted. She'd lost weight, had dark circles under her eyes. When we got to the restaurant, she barely touched her food. I asked her directly if she was happy, and she gave me this bright, fake smile, the same smile she used as a teenager when she was lying about having finished her homework. She insisted everything was wonderful, that she was just adjusting to having family around, that Kevin said she needed to be more flexible. That word, flexible, it lodged in my brain like a splinter. In my 4 decades working with financial fraud cases, I'd seen that pattern before. Someone slowly taking control, slowly making the victim question their own reasonable boundaries, slowly isolating them by making them feel guilty for completely normal expectations. I went home that night and pulled out the deed to Emma's house, sat at my kitchen table reading every word, making sure I understood exactly what legal protections I'd built in. The house was titled solely in Emma's name, purchased before the marriage, no commingling of funds. In Tennessee, that meant it was her separate property. Kevin had no legal claim to it whatsoever, regardless of being her husband. I made copies of everything, the deed, the purchase documents, the closing papers, put them in my safe deposit box at the bank, called my attorney Stuart Banksweet, worked together on dozens of cases over the years, and asked him to review everything, just to be certain, just to be prepared. Stuart called me back within 24 hours and confirmed what I already knew. That house was Emma's separate property, completely protected from any claims Kevin might make. Stuart said something that stuck with me. He told me I'd structured it perfectly, like I knew something might go wrong someday. I remember laughing, a bitter sound even to my own ears. I told Stuart I'd just been protecting my daughter the way Thomas taught me. But maybe, somewhere deep down, I had sensed something off about Kevin from the very beginning. Maybe those 43 years of spotting financial predators had given me instincts I didn't even fully recognize. 3 months later, Emma called crying. This time she couldn't hide it, couldn't pretend everything was fine. Kevin's sister Cassandra had moved in with her 2 children. That made 7 people living in Emma's 3-bedroom house. 7 people, and Emma told me she was the only one working, the only one buying groceries, the only one cleaning. She said she'd tried to talk to Kevin about it, and he'd exploded at her, told her she was ungrateful, that his family had nowhere else to go, that a good wife supports her husband's family. Emma said something that made my blood run cold. She told me Linda had started referring to the house as her son's home, that Linda had actually told Emma she was lucky Kevin let her stay there, let her stay, in the house I purchased, in the house legally titled in Emma's name alone. I knew then, sitting in my living room at 74 years old, that this wasn't going to end peacefully. Kevin and his family weren't just taking advantage of Emma's kindness, they were systematically taking over her home, her life, her identity. They were banking on her being too kind, too conflict-averse, too worn down, to fight back. But they'd made one critical miscalculation. Emma might be too kind to protect herself, but her mother wasn't, and I had something they didn't have. 7 decades of life experience, 4 decades of hunting down financial criminals, an ironclad legal documentation of exactly who owned that house. I told Emma I loved her, that everything would be okay, that she should trust me. After we hung up, I sat in the silence of my empty house, the house Thomas and I bought 46 years ago, the house where we raised our daughter to be loving and kind, and I made a decision. I was going to watch, I was going to wait, and I was going to document everything. Because at 74 years old, I knew something Kevin and his parasitic family didn't know. The best revenge is always perfectly legal, meticulously documented, and absolutely devastating. The call that changed everything came on a Wednesday afternoon in March. Emma's voice was shaking so badly, I could barely understand her at first. She told me she was pregnant 6 weeks along, and my heart should have soared with joy. My first grandchild, Thomas's legacy continuing, but instead of celebration in her voice, I heard pure terror. She explained that when she told Kevin about the baby, his first reaction wasn't happiness. He didn't hug her, didn't celebrate with her. Instead, he immediately told her the baby would have to share a room with Tyler because there wasn't enough space in the house. My pregnant daughter, carrying my grandchild, was being told there wasn't room for her own child in the house I had purchased for her. I sat down hard in my kitchen chair, my 74-year-old hands gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles went white. Emma kept talking, her words tumbling out like a dam had finally broken. She told me Linda had taken over the master bedroom 2 months earlier, claiming she needed it because of her arthritis. Emma and Kevin had moved into the smaller guest room. Cassandra's 2 children had the 3rd bedroom. Tyler lived in the basement. There were 7 people in that house, and my daughter, the actual legal owner, had the smallest room. When I asked Emma where she was planning to put a nursery, she started crying so hard she couldn't speak. Finally, she managed to tell me that Kevin had suggested maybe she should stay with me for a while after the baby was born, just until they figured out the space situation. He was trying to push my pregnant daughter out of her own house. After that call, I stopped waiting politely. I stopped trusting that this would somehow resolve itself. At 74, you learn that some people only understand consequences, not kindness. I pulled out my old forensic accounting toolkit, the same methodical approach I'd used for 4 decades to track down embezzlers and fraudsters. First, I started documenting everything. I created a spreadsheet, old habits die hard tracking, every phone call with Emma, every complaint, every incident, dates, times, specific quotes. I noted when Linda demanded the master bedroom, when Tyler moved in, when Cassandra arrived with her children. I documented that none of them paid rent, utilities, or bought groceries. I tracked it all with the same precision I'd once used to unravel million-dollar fraud schemes. Then, I did something Emma didn't know about. I drove to Nashville and parked down the street from her house, at different times over the course of 2 weeks, just watching. 74 years old, sitting in my sensible sedan with a thermos of coffee, watching my daughter's house like I was on a stakeout. At my age, people don't notice you, they assume you're just some confused old woman who parked in the wrong spot. What I saw made my blood boil. I watched Linda leave the house at 10 in the morning to get her nails done, come back with shopping bags, then leave again for lunch with friends. She wasn't disabled. She wasn't struggling with crippling arthritis. She was living like a queen in my daughter's house while Emma worked 10-hour days to pay for everything. I watched Tyler stumble out to his car at 2 in the afternoon, clearly unemployed despite claiming he was job hunting. I saw Cassandra drop her kids at the house with Emma, then drive off for hours while my pregnant daughter babysat children that weren't hers. The picture became crystal clear. Kevin's entire family was treating Emma like an unpaid nanny, maid, and meal ticket. But the worst discovery came when I decided to do some deeper digging. I called an old colleague from my accounting days, Sarah Chen, who now worked in credit monitoring. I asked her to run a quiet check on Emma's credit report, just to make sure everything was clean. Sarah was 71 herself, understood exactly why a mother would be worried. She called me back within 3 hours, and her voice was grim. There were 4 credit cards in Emma's name that she hadn't opened. Total balance across all of them, $42,000. Sarah walked me through the statements: charges at electronics stores, furniture stores, car dealerships. Someone had been systematically opening credit accounts in Emma's name and running up massive debt. The applications had all been filed within the last 18 months, all from the Nashville address, all with Emma's social security number. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. At 74, I thought I'd seen every type of financial abuse imaginable in my career. But this was my daughter, my Emma, someone, and I had a very good idea who was committing identity theft and fraud against my own child. I couldn't tell Emma yet, not while she was pregnant, not while she was living in that house surrounded by vipers. Instead, I called Stuart Banks again. This time, I didn't mince words. I told him I needed to understand every legal option available to protect Emma and remove Kevin's family from her property. I told him about the credit fraud. I told him about the systematic takeover of her home. Stuart was quiet for a long moment after I finished. Then he told me something that made my forensic accountant's heart sing with dark satisfaction. He explained that because the house was Emma's separate property, purchased before marriage with my money, Kevin had zero legal claim to it. Zero. Moreover, because Kevin's family members had never paid rent, had no written lease agreement, and were living there purely as guests of Kevin, who himself had no ownership rights, they were all considered unlawful occupants the moment Emma wanted them gone. As for the credit fraud, Stuart connected me with a criminal attorney named Patricia Alvarez. Patricia was younger than me, probably in her 50s, but sharp as a tack. She reviewed the evidence Sarah had gathered and told me we had a clear-cut case of identity theft. She could prove Kevin had access to all of Emma's personal documents, had motive, and had benefited from the fraudulent purchases. Patricia said she could build a case that would result in criminal charges, not just civil penalties. I sat in my home office surrounded by decades of case files from my accounting career, looking at the new files I was building against my own son-in-law, And I felt something I hadn't felt in years, not since Thomas died and I thought I'd lost my purpose. I felt sharp, focused, dangerous. I made copies of everything: the credit reports, the fraudulent account statements, my surveillance notes, photographs I'd taken of Kevin's family living lavishly in Emma's house. Stuart helped me compile documentation of property ownership, Tennessee property law, tenant rights, or, in this case, the complete lack of rights that unlawful occupants have. But I still needed one more piece of evidence. I needed to catch them saying the quiet part out loud. I needed proof that they knew exactly what they were doing, that this was a calculated takeover, not just a family helping each other out. So I did something I'm not entirely proud of, but at 74 years old, I've learned that sometimes you do what's necessary. I called Linda's cell phone from a blocked number, pretending to be from a real estate investment company. I told her I understood she lived at Emma's address, and asked if she'd be interested in selling the property. Linda's response was immediate and telling. She laughed and informed me that the house belonged to her son, that they'd finally gotten his wife to understand she was just living there by his grace, and that they had no intention of selling their family home. She said Emma had been a problem at first, always complaining and making everyone feel unwelcome, but they'd finally gotten her under control. Those were her exact words: under control. I recorded that entire conversation. In Tennessee, one-party consent means I only needed my own permission to record. I had Linda, in her own words, claiming ownership of property that legally belonged to Emma, admitting they'd systematically undermined my daughter's autonomy in her own home. That night, I organized everything into a comprehensive file: legal documents proving Emma's sole ownership, credit reports showing fraud, surveillance evidence of the family's parasitic lifestyle, the recorded conversation with Linda, witness statements I'd carefully gathered from Emma's neighbors, who confirmed that my daughter was the only one who actually lived there originally, and that Kevin's family had moved in gradually over time. I sat back and looked at my work. 43 years as a forensic accountant, and this might be the most important case I'd ever built. Not for some corporation or wealthy client, but for my daughter, for my grandchild who deserved to be born into a safe, stable home. For Thomas's memory, because I could feel him looking over my shoulder, telling me to protect Emma no matter what it took. The file was devastating, airtight, absolutely damning. Kevin and his family thought they were dealing with a desperate, isolated young woman who could be bullied into submission. They thought Emma's elderly mother was too old, too out of touch, too powerless to do anything but complain from the sidelines. They had no idea that this elderly mother had spent 4 decades hunting people exactly like them. They had no idea that every skill I'd honed tracking down white-collar criminals was about to be turned on them with the full force of a mother's rage and a grandmother's protective instinct. I called Emma and told her I was coming to visit the following week. I could hear the hesitation in her voice. Kevin had been telling her I wasn't welcome, that I caused too much drama, that I made his family uncomfortable. My pregnant daughter was actually apologizing to me for her home not being welcoming enough for her own mother. I told her not to worry, that I'd just take her out to lunch, that we wouldn't even go to the house if it made things easier. But I was lying. I wasn't coming for lunch. I was coming to execute the most perfectly legal eviction Kevin's parasitic family had ever seen, because they'd forgotten something crucial. They'd underestimated me because of my age, dismissed me as just some old woman who'd eventually give up and go away. But at 74, I knew something they didn't. Age doesn't make you weaker. It makes you more patient, more strategic, and infinitely more dangerous when someone threatens your family. They wanted to play games with my daughter's home, my grandchild's future, and my family's security. Fine, but they were playing against someone who'd spent 43 years learning every rule, every law, every loophole, and I'd just finished building a case that would destroy them completely. I arrived in Nashville on a Thursday morning, telling Emma I'd be there at noon for lunch. What I didn't tell her was that I'd actually arrived the night before. At 74, I've learned that preparation is everything, and I wanted one more chance to observe before making my move. That Wednesday evening, I parked down the street and watched through the living room window. Linda sprawled on the couch I'd bought, Tyler in the recliner, Cassandra's kids running wild, and Emma, 6 months pregnant, carrying plates of food to serve them all. My daughter was a servant in her own home. The next morning, I dressed carefully: soft pink cardigan, comfortable slacks, reading glasses on a chantha, ones I don't actually need but that make me look exactly like what people expect from a 74-year-old grandmother. Harmless, confused, easy to dismiss. I arrived at 11:30 and knocked on the door of the house I purchased. Tyler answered in pajama pants at nearly noon, holding cereal, looking annoyed. He recognized me and his expression shifted to contempt. He informed me Emma was at work until 1. I smiled sweetly and told him I'd come early to visit with the family, to get to know them better. Linda appeared behind him, and I saw the calculation in her eyes. Emma's wealthy mother who bought this house, maybe being nice to the old lady, would pay off. She invited me in with a fake smile, and gestured to my own couch like she was granting me permission to sit. I played my part perfectly, shuffled in slowly, commented on how lovely everything looked, fumbled with my purse like a confused elderly woman. I made grandmother noises about Cassandra's children, asked questions with wide-eyed innocence, accepted tea gratefully. And they fell for it completely. Linda settled into the couch, my couch hands started talking. She told me she considered this her permanent home now, that Kevin needed family around him because Emma's pregnancy mood swings were so difficult to handle. I made sympathetic noises, played the concerned mother, wondering if I'd raised a difficult daughter. That opened the floodgates. Linda leaned forward and explained that Emma had been resistant at first to having family in the house, had complained about groceries and bills, had been selfish about wanting private space. Linda informed me she'd had to have several conversations with Emma about what marriage really meant, about how family takes care of family. I nodded along, this sweet, confused old lady grateful to finally understand what was happening. Linda kept talking. She told me Emma had actually suggested that family members should pay rent. Can you imagine? She said Linda had shut that down immediately. She called charging family rent trashy and said it showed poor upbringing. Poor upbringing. This woman was insulting my parenting while living rent-free in my daughter's house. But I just smiled and nodded. Tyler joined in then, sprawling on the recliner with his cereal. He told me Emma was always tired and cranky, that she made everyone feel unwelcome, that she'd been much easier to deal with lately now that she understood this was the family home. That word, flexible, their code for controlled. I asked gentle questions, playing dumb. Asked who paid the mortgage, and Linda waved her hand dismissively and said Kevin took care of all that Emma didn't need to worry about financial details. I knew that was a lie. Emma paid everything, but I filed away Linda's casual claim that Kevin handled the money. Then Linda said something that made my blood freeze while my face stayed pleasant. She mentioned that Kevin had been looking into Emma's mental health options, that he was concerned pregnancy hormones were making her irrational, that he'd spoken to a lawyer about what options they'd have if Emma became truly unstable after the baby was born. My forensic accountant brain immediately understood. They weren't just taking over Emma's house, they were building a case to paint her as mentally incompetent. If they could establish Emma was unstable, Kevin could potentially gain legal authority over her affairs, including her house. I made worried grandmother noises, asked if Emma was seeing a doctor. Linda assured me Kevin was handling everything, that he was such a devoted husband. The subtext was clear. They were setting up a scenario where Kevin, supported by his family's testimony, could claim Emma was mentally unfit. I glanced at my watch, mentioned I should meet Emma for lunch. Linda walked me to the door and patted my hand condescendingly. She told me not to worry, that they'd all take care of Emma and make sure she didn't do anything foolish with the house or finances. Make sure she didn't do anything foolish. This woman thought she had control over my daughter's property, life, and future. She thought the elderly mother was too out of touch to understand what was really happening. I thanked her for the tea, shuffled out like a grateful old woman who'd been reassured by responsible adults. But the moment my car door closed, everything changed. I called Stuart Banks immediately, told him to move up our timeline, told him about the mental incompetency angle, Linda's explicit claims of ownership, their plan to put my grandchild in a basement. Stuart's voice was grim. He said we needed to act immediately, before they could establish any legal framework around Emma's supposed instability. He'd file emergency eviction papers that afternoon. We'd serve them tomorrow morning. I picked up Emma for lunch. She looked exhausted, her pregnant belly prominent, dark circles under her eyes. At the restaurant, I held her hand and told her I loved her, told her to trust me for 24 hours, told her to pack a small bag tonight without Kevin noticing and be ready to leave quickly tomorrow morning. She looked terrified, but I promised her that by this time tomorrow, she'd be back in her own home with Kevin's entire family gone. That evening, I reviewed everything one final time with Stuart and Patricia. Property ownership documentation, credit fraud, evidence, recorded conversations, notes from today proving their mental incompetency strategy. It was airtight, devastating, perfectly legal. Kevin's family thought they were dealing with a confused old lady and her weak daughter. They thought age made me irrelevant, that they could build their empire on my investment without consequences. Tomorrow morning, they'd learn that age doesn't make you weak. It makes you patient, strategic, and when you finally strike, absolutely merciless. Friday morning arrived with crystal clear skies, the kind of beautiful June day that makes you believe good things are possible. I woke up at 5 a.m. in my hotel room, made myself a strong cup of coffee, and reviewed my battle plan one final time. At 74 years old, I've learned that the difference between justice and chaos is preparation. Stuart had worked late into the night. By midnight Thursday, he'd filed emergency eviction papers with the Davidson County Court. By 6 a.m. Friday, we had our court order. The document was beautiful in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. Emma Sullivan was the sole legal owner of the property at her Nashville address. Kevin Gallagher had no ownership interest whatsoever. Linda Gallagher, Tyler Gallagher, Cassandra Morrison, and her 2 minor children were occupying the property without lease agreement, without payment of rent, and without legal permission from the actual owner. They had 48 hours to vacate or face arrest for criminal trespassing. But Stuart and I both knew that 48 hours would give them time to destroy property, steal valuables, or create some manufactured emergency to delay the process. So we'd also secured an emergency enforcement order, meaning a sheriff's deputy would be present to supervise the eviction immediately. We weren't giving them 2 days. We were giving them 2 hours. I called Emma at 7 a.m. and told her I was picking her up for breakfast, that she should bring that bag I'd mentioned. Her voice was shaking when she asked me what was happening. I told her she'd understand soon, that she needed to trust her mother, and that she should leave the house before Kevin woke up if possible. 20 minutes later, Emma was in my car with a small suitcase, her eyes red from crying. She told me she'd barely slept, that Kevin had been suspicious about why she was being secretive, that she was terrified of what he'd do when he found out she'd left. I took my daughter's hand and told her Kevin would never have the opportunity to do anything to her ever again. We met Stuart and Patricia at a diner 3 miles from Emma's house. Over breakfast that my daughter barely touched, we laid everything out for her, showed her the court orders, showed her the credit fraud evidence, the $42,000 in debt that Kevin had accumulated in her name, showed her the deed proving she was the sole owner of her home, showed her Tennessee property law that made it clear Kevin's family had absolutely no legal right to be there. Emma stared at the documents like she couldn't quite process what she was seeing. She kept saying she'd had no idea about the credit cards, that Kevin must have stolen her social security card from her purse, that she'd trusted him completely. Patricia explained, gently but firmly, that this was identity theft, a criminal offense, and that we had enough evidence to press charges if Emma chose to do so. Then I showed Emma the recording of my conversation with Linda, played it right there in the diner booth, let her hear Kevin's mother claiming the house belonged to her son, admitting they'd gotten Emma under control, dismissing my daughter's legal ownership of her own property. I watched Emma's face transform from confusion to understanding to rage. My daughter looked up at me with tears streaming down her face and asked why I'd never told her I'd put the house solely in her name. I explained that I'd done it to protect her, that Thomas had taught me to always safeguard family, legally first, that I'd hoped it would never matter but I'd wanted her protected just in case. Emma started sobbing then, said she'd thought she was going crazy, that Kevin kept telling her she was being dramatic and unreasonable, that she'd started to believe she really was the problem. Patricia leaned forward and told Emma something important. She explained that what Kevin's family had been doing was called financial abuse and coercive control. The gaslighting about her memory, the isolation from support systems, the systematic takeover of her living space, the plan to paint her as mentally incompetent, these were all recognized patterns of abuse. Patricia said that at 6 months pregnant, Emma was particularly vulnerable, and that Kevin had likely calculated that this was the perfect time to push his agenda because Emma would be too overwhelmed and dependent to fight back. But they'd miscalculated one crucial factor. Emma had a mother who'd spent 43 years tracking down sophisticated financial criminals. Kevin and his family were amateurs playing in a professionals arena. At 9 a.m., we drove to Emma's house in a convoy. My car with Emma, Stuart's car with Patricia, and a sheriff's department vehicle with Deputy Marshal James Rodriguez, who'd been briefed on the situation and had reviewed all our documentation. Deputy Rodriguez was probably in his 40s, professional and calm. And he'd told Stuart he'd handled plenty of illegal evictions before. He knew exactly how these situations could escalate. I parked across the street while Stuart, Patricia, and Deputy Rodriguez approached the front door. Emma stayed in the car with me, gripping my hand so tightly I could feel her pulse racing. I told her to breathe, that everything was about to change, that in 2 hours she'd walk back into her home as its rightful owner with all the parasites gone. Deputy Rodriguez knocked firmly on the door. We waited, knocked again. Finally, Tyler opened the door in his usual pajama pants, looking annoyed and half asleep. I couldn't hear the conversation from where we sat, but I could see Tyler's body language change from irritation to confusion to alarm as Deputy Rodriguez showed him the court order. Tyler yelled something back into the house. Within 30 seconds, Kevin appeared at the door, wearing shorts and a t-shirt, hair disheveled. I watched as Stuart stepped forward and handed Kevin the eviction notice. Watched as Kevin read it, his face going pale. Watched as he started gesturing wildly, clearly arguing, while Deputy Rodriguez remained completely calm and unmoved. Linda appeared next, then Cassandra. The whole parasitic family gathered at the door, and I could see the panic spreading among them like wildfire. They'd thought they were untouchable. They'd thought Emma was too weak and I was too old. They'd thought they'd successfully taken over a property worth $350,000 without consequences. They were about to learn exactly how wrong they'd been. Kevin stumbled out onto the front porch, waving the eviction papers like they were on fire. Even from across the street, I could see the color draining from his face as reality set in. Deputy Rodriguez stood firmly blocking the doorway, his hand resting casually near his belt, a subtle reminder that this was a legal process backed by law enforcement authority. Stuart stood beside the deputy with that calm, professional demeanor I'd seen him use in countless depositions over the years. He was explaining something to Kevin, pointing at specific sections of the document. I knew exactly what he was saying because we'd rehearsed it. The house belonged solely to Emma. Kevin had no legal claim whatsoever, and every person inside was now officially trespassing on private property. Linda pushed past Kevin onto the porch, her morning robe flapping, her face twisted with indignation. She started jabbing her finger at Stuart, clearly shouting something about her rights, about how they'd lived there for over a year, about how they couldn't just be thrown out. I'd seen this reaction before in my accounting career, the moment when fraudsters realized they'd been caught and cycle rapidly through denial, anger, and desperate bargaining. Deputy Rodriguez said something sharp and Linda stepped back. The power dynamic had shifted completely in under 5 minutes. Yesterday, Linda had patted my hand condescendingly in that house. Today, she was being informed by law enforcement that she was an illegal occupant with 2 hours to pack her belongings and leave. Stuart made a phone call or prearranged signal. I squeezed Emma's hand and told her it was time. We got out of my car and walked across the street. Emma was shaking, and I kept my arm around her shoulders, supporting her both physically and emotionally. My pregnant daughter, who'd been terrorized in her own home, was about to reclaim what was rightfully hers. Kevin saw Emma approaching, and his expression transformed from panic to rage. He started toward her, and Deputy Rodriguez immediately stepped between them. The deputy's voice carried across the lawn firm, authoritative, warning Kevin to stay back. Kevin stopped but started yelling at Emma, demanding to know what she thought she was doing, calling her ungrateful and manipulative, saying she'd planned this betrayal all along. Betrayal? This man who'd committed identity theft, stolen $42,000 in her name, let his family take over her home, and was planning to have her declared mentally incompetent. He had the audacity to call my daughter's legal protection of her own property a betrayal. I felt Emma start to crumble beside me, heard her breath catch like she might apologize, like she might try to smooth things over the way she'd been conditioned to do for 3 years. I tightened my grip on her shoulders and told her firmly that she had nothing to apologize for, that this was her house, her legal property, and she was simply exercising her rights as the owner. Patricia stepped forward then and addressed Kevin directly. She informed him that, in addition to the eviction, he was facing criminal investigation for identity theft and credit fraud. She said the evidence had been turned over to the Davidson County District Attorney's Office and that he should expect to hear from them within the week. She advised him to secure legal representation immediately. The look on Kevin's face was something I'll remember for the rest of my life. Pure shock. He'd genuinely believed he'd gotten away with it, that Emma would never find out, that the confused old mother-in-law would never put the pieces together. He'd thought he was so clever, so slick, stealing from his pregnant wife while systematically isolating her and preparing to have her declared incompetent. Tyler appeared in the doorway then, demanding to know what was happening. Deputy Rodriguez told him the same thing he'd told Kevin. This property belonged to Emma Sullivan alone. They were all trespassing, and they had 2 hours to gather their belongings and vacate or they'd be arrested. Tyler started arguing that they had tenant rights, that you can't just throw people out without 30 days' notice. Stewart had clearly been waiting for this argument. He pulled out another document and explained in excruciating legal detail that tenant rights only apply to individuals with valid lease agreements who pay rent, since none of them had ever paid a single dollar in rent, since there was no written lease agreement, and since the actual property owner Emma had never given them permission to live there. They were occupants at will, and the property owner was now revoking that permission. No 30-day notice required under Tennessee law. I watched it sink in for all of them simultaneously. They had no legal leg to stand on, none. Every assumption they'd made about their security in that house, every plan they'd built around permanent occupancy, every dismissal of Emma's ownership was all collapsing in real time. Cassandra started crying, saying she had nowhere to go with her children, that they couldn't just be thrown into the street. Patricia responded that they'd had months to secure alternative housing, that choosing to live rent-free off someone else's generosity didn't create legal obligations when that generosity ended. She suggested Cassandra start making phone calls. Linda tried a different approach. She turned to Emma directly and attempted the concerned mother-in-law routine, telling Emma that surely she didn't really want to do this to Kevin's family, that pregnancy hormones were making her emotional, that they could all sit down and talk this through like adults. She was still trying to gaslight my daughter, still trying to paint Emma as irrational and unstable, even with the sheriff's deputy and 2 attorneys standing right there. I stepped forward then, looked Linda straight in the eye, and told her I'd recorded our conversation from yesterday, told her I had her on tape claiming ownership of Emma's property, admitting they'd gotten my daughter under control, dismissing Emma's legal rights. I informed her that recording was now evidence in multiple legal proceedings and that every word she'd said was about to become part of the public court record. Linda's face went white. She tried to sputter something about entrapment, about illegal recordings, but Stewart cut her off. He explained that Tennessee is a one-party consent state, which meant I'd only needed my own permission to record our conversation. It was completely legal, completely admissible, and completely damning. Deputy Rodriguez gave them all a final warning. 2 hours to pack personal belongings, only no furniture, no household items, nothing that belonged to the house. He'd be supervising the entire process to ensure nothing was stolen or damaged. Anyone who refused to comply would be arrested immediately for criminal trespassing. Kevin made one last desperate attempt. He turned to Emma and tried a different tactic, the apologetic husband. He told her he loved her, that he was sorry things had gotten so out of hand, that they could fix this if she'd just call off the lawyers. He said they could go to counseling, work through their problems, that throwing him out wasn't the answer. Emma looked at him for a long moment. My daughter, who'd been broken down and controlled for so long, who'd been made to feel crazy and difficult and ungrateful. She took a deep breath, and when she spoke, her voice was steady and clear. She told Kevin that he'd stolen from her, lied to her, let his family destroy her peace in her own home, and planned to have her declared mentally incompetent so he could take everything. She said she didn't love him anymore, didn't trust him, and wanted him out of her house and her life. Then Emma told him she was filing for divorce. Her hand moved protectively to her pregnant belly, and she said her child deserved better than a father who was a thief and a manipulator. Kevin's expression transformed from fake remorse to pure hatred in an instant. He called her names I won't repeat. Deputy Rodriguez immediately stepped between them again and informed Kevin that if he made one more threatening statement, he'd be arrested right now and wouldn't get the 2 hours to pack. Stewart handed Kevin another document, divorce papers, already filed that morning. Kevin would receive nothing from the divorce. No house, no assets, no alimony, and Stuart informed him that Emma would be seeking full custody of their child based on Kevin's criminal behavior and financial fraud. I watched the reality crush Kevin completely. He'd gambled everything on controlling Emma, on stealing her property and identity, on building his family's empire on her foundation, and he'd lost, catastrophically. He'd be facing criminal charges, a divorce where he got nothing, and the loss of his child, all because he'd underestimated the woman he married and the mother who protected her. The next 2 hours were chaos. Kevin's family scrambled to pack, arguing with each other, blaming Emma, blaming me, threatening lawsuits they'd never filed because they had no case. Deputy Rodriguez supervised everything, making sure they took only their personal items. Emma and I sat in my car and watched. I held my daughter's hand while she cried, not from sadness but from relief. She kept saying she couldn't believe it was really happening, that she'd be free, that her baby would be safe. By noon, Kevin's entire family was gone. The house felt different when we finally walked inside, empty in a way that had nothing to do with Kevin's family being gone, empty of the tension, the fear, the constant walking on eggshells that had filled every corner for the past 2 years. Emma stood in her own living room like she was seeing it for the first time, and in a way, she was. This was the first moment she'd truly owned this space since Kevin's family had invaded. But the relief lasted about 10 minutes before reality set in. The house was destroyed. Not just messy destroyed. Linda had apparently decided that if she couldn't have the master bedroom, she'd make sure Emma wouldn't enjoy it either. Makeup ground into the carpet. Cigarette burns on the dresser I'd bought for Emma. The bathroom looked like it hadn't been cleaned in months. Tyler's basement was even worse. The smell hit us before we even got down the stairs. Food wrappers everywhere, stains on the carpet, holes punched in the walls. Emma started crying again, but this time, from overwhelming exhaustion. She was 6 months pregnant, emotionally drained, and facing thousands of dollars in repairs to her own home. I put my arm around her and told her we'd handle it, that this was just property damage and property could be fixed. What mattered was that it was hers again, truly hers, and no one could take it from her. Stuart had stayed to document everything. He walked through with his phone, taking videos of every bit of damage, every vindictive act of destruction Kevin's family had committed on their way out. This would all become evidence. He explained evidence that would make it very difficult for Kevin to claim he'd been a responsible partner in the marriage. Evidence that would support Emma's custody case. Evidence of malicious property damage that could result in additional charges. But I had a more immediate concern. While Stuart documented the damage and Patricia made calls about Kevin's criminal charges, I pulled Emma aside and told her we needed to talk about the credit cards, the $42,000 in fraudulent debt that Kevin had accumulated in her name. Emma looked panicked, asked how she'd ever pay that back, said her savings were gone and she'd never be able to work enough while pregnant and caring for a newborn. I told her to breathe, told her that's why I'd brought Patricia onto the team. Patricia specialized in identity theft cases, and she'd already filed police reports on each fraudulent account. With the documentation we had proof that Kevin had access to Emma's personal information, proof that Emma hadn't benefited from any of the purchases, proof that Kevin had deliberately hidden these accounts from her. We could get the charges reversed. It would take time, probably 3 to 6 months, but the debt would be eliminated. Emma wouldn't owe a penny. The relief on my daughter's face was worth every dollar I'd spent on attorneys, every hour I'd spent building the case against Kevin. She asked me how much all this legal help was costing, said she'd pay me back somehow. I told her what Thomas would have told her: you don't pay back family for protecting you. You just promise to protect your own children the same way someday. Over the next 3 days, while Emma stayed at my house in Memphis recovering from the emotional trauma, I coordinated the repairs to her Nashville home, called in professional cleaners, hired contractors to fix the wall damage, arranged for carpet replacement in the master bedroom and basement. It cost me nearly $15,000, a fraction of what the house was worth, a fraction of what I'd already invested in Emma's future. But more importantly, I spent those 3 days gathering additional evidence, because evicting Kevin's family was just the first step. I wanted to make absolutely certain they could never come back, never make claims, never threaten Emma again. I discovered something interesting while going through the damaged house. In Tyler's trash-filled basement, under a pile of pizza boxes and beer cans, I found documents, bank statements in Kevin's name, showing deposits that didn't match his insurance sales income. Receipts for expensive purchases: a 65-inch television, a gaming computer, new furniture, all bought with credit cards that I now knew were fraudulently opened in Emma's name. I photographed everything and sent it to Patricia. She called me back within an hour, her voice tight with anger. She told me this was even worse than we'd thought. Kevin hadn't just been opening credit cards in Emma's name, he'd been systematically stealing her identity for over 18 months, living a lifestyle he couldn't afford on his own income, and sticking Emma with the bills. The television Tyler had been watching in the basement, purchased with Emma's stolen credit, the computer he'd been gaming on until 3 a.m., Emma's credit, the furniture Linda had been so comfortable on in the master bedroom, Emma's credit. Patricia said we now had enough evidence for felony identity theft charges, not just the misdemeanor fraud she'd initially anticipated. She was amending her complaint to the district attorney's office. Kevin could be looking at 3 to 5 years in prison if convicted. I won't lie, that satisfied something dark in my 74-year-old heart. Not revenge exactly, but justice. The certainty that Kevin wouldn't just walk away from what he'd done to my daughter. But I wasn't finished yet. I started making phone calls to Emma's neighbors, the ones I'd briefly interviewed during my initial investigation, asked them if they'd be willing to provide written statements about what they'd observed: the parade of Kevin's family members moving in, the noise complaints, the times they'd seen Emma crying on the porch or looking distressed. Every single neighbor I contacted said yes, they'd all liked Emma, had been concerned about her, had noticed the takeover happening, but hadn't known how to help. I compiled their statements into a document, 14 neighbors, all describing the same pattern: a young pregnant woman being slowly consumed by her husband's parasitic family, isolated and controlled in her own home. It painted a devastating picture, and it would be critical for the custody case, because that was my next concern, making absolutely certain that Kevin would have no rights to my grandchild. Patricia had been clear. Tennessee family courts generally favored shared custody unless there were compelling reasons otherwise. We needed to build an ironclad case that Kevin was unfit to parent, that his criminal behavior and financial irresponsibility made him a danger to a child's well-being. So I kept digging, called Kevin's employer, carefully framing my questions as a concerned mother-in-law checking on her daughter's financial stability, discovered that Kevin had been on a performance improvement plan for 3 months, that his sales numbers were terrible, that he was one more bad quarter away from being fired. His income was half what he'd claimed to Emma. I contacted the credit card companies directly, explained that my daughter was a victim of identity theft, and requested detailed statements of every purchase made on the fraudulent accounts. When those statements arrived, I went through them line by line with my old forensic accounting skills, highlighted every purchase that benefited Kevin's family but not Emma, created spreadsheets showing the systematic theft, made it impossible for any judge to see this as anything but deliberate, malicious financial abuse. Stuart and Patricia were impressed. Patricia told me I'd built a stronger case than most law enforcement investigations produce. Stuart said I haven't lost my touch, that I could come out of retirement any time if I wanted, but I didn't want another career. I just wanted my daughter safe and my grandchild protected. On the 4th day, Emma came back to Nashville. We walked into her repaired house together, and she broke down crying good tears this time. The carpets were clean, the walls were patched and painted. The master bedroom looked like it had when I'd first bought the house, before Linda had destroyed it. Emma had her home back, truly back, better than it had been in 2 years. That evening, we sat in her living room drinking tea decaf for Emma, because of the pregnancy, and she asked me how I'd known to protect her with the house deed, how I'd known, 3 years ago when she was so happy and in love, that something might go wrong. I told her the truth, said I hadn't known, not specifically, but Thomas had taught me that protecting the people you love means preparing for possibilities you hope never happen. It means trusting your instincts when something feels off, even slightly. It means understanding that paperwork and legal structures aren't signs of distrust, they're insurance policies against worst-case scenarios. Emma asked if I'd ever trusted Kevin. I thought about that for a moment before answering honestly. Told her that Kevin had always seemed a little too smooth, a little too focused on what the marriage could give him rather than what he could give to her. But I'd hoped I was wrong, hoped my forensic accountant's suspicious nature was just seeing shadows where there was light. Turns out my instincts were right, and because I'd listened to them 3 years ago, my daughter still had a home and a future. Emma looked at me with tears in her eyes and said I'd saved her life. I told her that's what mothers do, we protect our children, no matter how old they get, no matter what it takes. And at 74 years old, I still had plenty of fight left in me. 3 weeks after the eviction, Kevin made his fatal mistake. He decided to fight back. I got the call from Stuart on a Wednesday morning in late June. He told me Kevin had filed a motion claiming community property rights to Emma's house, arguing that improvements made during the marriage gave him partial ownership. Kevin was also contesting the divorce settlement, demanding half of Emma's assets and spousal support. And this was the part that made my blood boil. He was filing for joint custody of the baby, claiming Emma was mentally unstable and he was the responsible parent. Stuart's voice was calm, but I could hear the edge underneath. He told me we had a court hearing scheduled in 2 weeks, that Kevin had apparently found himself a lawyer willing to argue these claims, and that we needed to be prepared for a fight. Kevin wasn't going quietly. He was going to try to drag Emma through court, destroy her reputation, and take everything he could. I hung up the phone and sat in my kitchen for exactly 5 minutes, letting the rage wash over me and then recede. At 74, I've learned that anger is useful only when it's channeled into strategy. And Kevin had just handed me the perfect opportunity to destroy him completely. Because here's what Kevin didn't know. I'd been preparing for this exact scenario for 3 weeks. While he'd been licking his wounds and plotting his comeback, I'd been building a case so comprehensive, so devastating, that his pathetic legal motion wouldn't just be denied, it would bury him. I called an emergency meeting with Stuart and Patricia for that afternoon. When we sat down in Stuart's conference room, I pulled out 3 thick binders I'd been compiling. Binder 1, complete financial documentation of every fraudulent credit card, every illegal purchase, every forged signature. Patricia had already filed the criminal complaint, but I'd expanded it. I'd tracked down every single merchant where Kevin had used Emma's stolen credit, obtained security camera footage from several stores showing Kevin making the purchases himself, and compiled it all into an irrefutable timeline of systematic identity theft. Binder 2, medical and psychological documentation. I'd convinced Emma to see a therapist specializing in domestic abuse, not because I thought Emma was unstable, but because I wanted a professional evaluation stating exactly the opposite. Dr. Rebecca Winters had spent 5 hours with Emma over 3 sessions and produced a detailed report. She confirmed that Emma showed no signs of mental instability, no psychological disorders, no impairment of judgment. What Emma did show were classic symptoms of someone who'd been subjected to financial abuse and coercive control. Dr. Winters's report was devastating to Kevin's narrative. Emma wasn't crazy, she was a victim of calculated psychological manipulation. Binder 3, witness statements and evidence of Kevin's unfitness as a parent. The 14 neighbor statements I'd collected, documentation from Kevin's employer showing his performance problems and impending termination, records from the creditors showing Kevin's personal debts. Turns out he owed $30,000 in his own name, on top of the $42,000 he'd stolen from Emma. And most damning, I'd discovered that Kevin had a DUI from 7 years ago that he'd never told Emma about, and his driver's license had been suspended twice for unpaid traffic violations. Stuart looked through the binders and actually laughed a sharp, satisfied sound. He told me this wasn't just enough to defend against Kevin's motion. This was enough to annihilate him in court. Patricia agreed. She said Kevin's lawyer had either not done basic due diligence or was incompetent, because filing these motions while facing felony identity theft charges was legal suicide. The court hearing arrived on a sweltering July morning. Emma was 7 months pregnant now, visibly showing, and I'd coached her carefully on how to present herself. Professional but sympathetic, strong but not aggressive. A woman who'd been victimized but was now taking control of her life. We arrived at the Davidson County Courthouse at 8:30 for a 9 o'clock hearing. Kevin was already there with his lawyer, a young man who looked fresh out of law school and deeply uncomfortable. Kevin himself looked terrible. He'd lost weight, had dark circles under his eyes, clearly wasn't sleeping. Good. Kevin tried to approach Emma before we entered the courtroom, tried to talk to her, but Stuart physically stepped between them and informed Kevin that his client had a restraining order application pending, and any contact would violate it. Kevin's lawyer pulled him back, clearly recognizing this was a bad tactical move. Judge Catherine Morrison presided over the hearing. She was probably in her 60s, with steel gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. I'd done my research on her too. She had a reputation for nonsense rulings and zero tolerance for anyone who wasted her time with frivolous motions. Kevin's lawyer went first. He presented Kevin's motion claiming community property rights, arguing that Kevin had contributed to home improvements and maintenance during the marriage. He claimed Kevin had painted the exterior, done landscaping work, and therefore deserved equity in the property. He argued that Emma's mental state during pregnancy made her an unreliable parent, and that Kevin should have primary custody with Emma getting supervised visitation. I watched Judge Morrison's expression remain neutral, but I noticed her pen hadn't moved to take notes. Not a good sign for Kevin. Then Stuart stood up, and for the next 45 minutes, he systematically demolished every single argument Kevin had made. He presented the property deed showing Emma as sole owner, purchased with my money before the marriage. He presented Tennessee property law clearly stating that separate property remains separate unless deliberately commingled, which had never happened. He pointed out that Kevin had never paid the mortgage, never paid property taxes, and had no financial investment in the house whatsoever. As for the home improvements Kevin claimed to have made, Stuart pulled out receipts showing that every single repair and improvement had been paid for by Emma or by me. The exterior painting, I'd hired and paid for professional painters. The landscaping, Emma had paid a landscaping company. Kevin hadn't contributed a single dollar or an hour of legitimate labor. Then Stuart moved to the custody issue. He presented Dr. Winters' psychological evaluation stating Emma was mentally sound, emotionally stable, and fully capable of parenting. He contrasted that with Kevin's criminal charges for identity theft, his employment problems, his financial irresponsibility. But Patricia delivered the killing blow. She stood up and asked the judge's permission to present criminal evidence relevant to the custody determination. Judge Morrison granted it. Patricia opened her laptop and projected Kevin's fraudulent purchases onto the courtroom screen. We watched Kevin's face go pale as Patricia walked through it. 65-inch television purchased March 15th with Emma's stolen credit while Emma was at work. Gaming computer purchased April 3rd. Furniture purchased April 22nd. Every single purchase made by Kevin while systematically hiding the debt from his pregnant wife. Patricia showed the security camera footage from Best Buy, clear images of Kevin using a credit card in Emma's name, Kevin's signature on the receipt. Then Patricia dropped the final bomb. She informed the court that the district attorney's office had formally charged Kevin with felony identity theft the previous week. He was facing arraignment in 3 weeks. She argued that a man facing prison time for stealing from his own wife was not fit to have custody of a child. Judge Morrison's expression had shifted from neutral to coldly furious. She asked Kevin's lawyer if he had any response. The poor young man looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. He stammered something about how they weren't aware of the extent of the charges, that they needed time to review the evidence. Judge Morrison cut him off. She said she didn't need time to review anything because the evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable. She denied Kevin's motion for property rights completely. She denied his motion for spousal support. She granted Emma's divorce petition with prejudice, meaning Kevin could never refile these claims. And then she did something I hadn't even dared hope for. She granted Emma sole legal and physical custody of the baby, with Kevin receiving no visitation rights until after his criminal case was resolved and only then with court supervision. Kevin exploded, started shouting at the judge, calling Emma names, saying this was all a conspiracy orchestrated by Emma's rich mother. 2 bailiffs moved toward him immediately. Judge Morrison banged her gavel and warned Kevin that if he didn't control himself, she'd hold him in contempt. Kevin's lawyer managed to get him quiet, but the damage was done. Judge Morrison added to the record that Kevin's outburst demonstrated exactly the kind of unstable behavior that made him unfit for custody. She signed the orders right there in the courtroom. It was over, completely over. Kevin had lost everything: his marriage, his home, any claim to his child, and in 3 weeks he'd likely lose his freedom too. As we left the courtroom, Kevin tried one last time to get to Emma. He pushed past his lawyer and grabbed Emma's arm, his face twisted with rage and desperation. He started saying horrible things, that she'd ruined his life, that she'd pay for this, that his whole family would make sure she regretted it. Security intervened immediately, pulled Kevin away, and Judge Morrison, who'd seen the whole thing, came out of the courtroom and told the bailiffs to arrest Kevin for violating the restraining order she'd just granted. We watched as Kevin was handcuffed right there in the courthouse hallway, still screaming threats, completely unhinged. Emma was shaking beside me, but when I looked at her face, I didn't see fear, I saw relief. After 3 years of manipulation and control, after months of being told she was crazy and difficult, after weeks of terror about losing her child, it was finally, truly over. Stuart walked us to our car and told Emma she was now one of the best protected domestic abuse survivors he'd ever represented. Between the criminal charges, the restraining order, the custody order, and Kevin's courthouse arrest, there was no avenue left for Kevin to hurt her. She was safe, her baby was safe. That night, back at Emma's house, her house, legally and completely, we sat together in the nursery. I'd helped her set up, pale yellow walls, white furniture, everything ready for my grandchild's arrival. Emma put her hand on her pregnant belly and told me she still couldn't quite believe it was real, that she was actually free. I told her it was real. And I told her something else, that at 74 years old, I'd learned that the best protection for your family isn't hoping for the best. It's preparing for the worst while hoping you never need those preparations. I'd protected her with that property deed 3 years ago. And when Kevin finally showed his true nature, that protection had saved her. Emma asked me what would have happened if I hadn't put the house solely in her name. I didn't sugarcoat it. Told her that in Tennessee's divorce courts, without that clear separate property protection, Kevin could have claimed half the house value, $175,000. Combined with the credit fraud she would have been stuck with, the custody battle she would have faced without resources to fight, and the isolation Kevin's family had created, she likely would have lost everything, her home, her child, her future. But that hadn't happened. Because her mother was a 74-year-old former forensic accountant who knew exactly how to protect what mattered most. My grandson Thomas, named after his grandfather who never got to meet him, was born on September 15, exactly 3 weeks after Kevin's criminal trial concluded. Kevin got 4 years in state prison for felony identity theft, with the possibility of parole after 2. He'd never hold his son, at least not while Thomas was young enough to be influenced by him. I was in the delivery room when Thomas arrived, holding Emma's hand through every contraction, watching my daughter become a mother with a strength I'd always known she possessed but that Kevin had spent 3 years trying to destroy. When the nurse placed that tiny boy in Emma's arms, both of us cried, but these were tears of pure joy, untainted by fear or uncertainty for the first time in years. The first few weeks were exhausting, as all newborn periods are. But Emma lived just 2 hours from me in Memphis, and I drove to Nashville every weekend to help, change diapers at 2 a.m., walked the floors with Thomas when he was fussy, cooked meals for Emma while she recovered. At 74, I'd thought my days of infant care were long behind me, but holding my grandson, watching him grow stronger every day in the safety of his mother's home, it reminded me why I'd fought so hard. Kevin's family tried to make contact exactly once. Linda called Emma's number about a month after Thomas was born. Somehow, having gotten past the blocks Emma had put in place, she left a voicemail saying she had a right to see her grandson. That blood was thicker than water, that Emma was being cruel, keeping a grandmother from her grandchild. I listened to that voicemail with Emma, watched my daughter's face cycle through fear, then anger, then finally something close to pity. Emma called Stuart, who sent Linda a cease and desist letter, reminding her that she had no legal rights to the child, that any further contact would be considered harassment, and that given her participation in Kevin's financial abuse of Emma, she should consider herself fortunate not to be facing charges as an accessory. We never heard from Linda again, or Tyler, or Cassandra. They'd scattered after the eviction like roaches when the lights come on, and as far as I was concerned, good riddance. Some people are toxic, and the greatest gift you can give yourself is cutting them out completely. The credit card fraud case took 6 months to fully resolve, just as Patricia had predicted. But Emma didn't pay a single penny of that $42,000. Every fraudulent account was closed, every charge was reversed, and Emma's credit score actually improved once the criminal activity was removed from her record. Kevin, meanwhile, was now responsible for restitution. He'd be paying off Emma's stolen money from prison wages for the next decade at least. Emma went back to work when Thomas was 3 months old, doing remote data analysis from home so she could be with her son. The house in Nashville had appreciated in value, now worth nearly $400,000. Nalazand was completely paid off thanks to the life insurance money Thomas had left me that I'd used to purchase it outright. Emma owned her home free and clear, had a good job, had a healthy baby, and had her life back. But more than the financial security, more than the legal victories, what mattered most was watching my daughter rebuild her sense of self. The woman Kevin had systematically broken down, made to question her own memory and judgment, isolated from her support systems, that woman was gone. In her place was someone stronger, wiser, more certain of her own worth. Emma told me something profound about 6 months after Thomas was born. We were sitting in her living room, the same living room where I'd once watched through the window as she served Kevin's parasitic family, and she said she was grateful for what had happened, not the abuse itself, but the clarity it had given her about who she could trust, about the importance of legal protection, about standing up for herself even when it felt impossible. She said she was raising Thomas to understand that kindness doesn't mean being a doormat, that family obligations go both ways, and that protecting yourself legally isn't a sign of distrust, it's a sign of wisdom. She was teaching him lessons it had taken her 36 years and a devastating marriage to learn. I told her that's exactly what Thomas, her father, would have wanted. He'd spent our entire marriage teaching me those same lessons, preparing me to protect our family if anything ever happened to him. And when he died 10 years ago, I'd honored that by making sure Emma was legally protected even before she knew she needed it. The house deed I'd structured so carefully 3 years ago, putting it solely in Emma's name, that single decision had been the foundation that saved her. Without it, Kevin could have claimed half its value in the divorce. He could have forced a sale, left Emma and Thomas homeless, trapped her in poverty while he walked away with nearly $200,000. But because I'd listened to my instincts, because I'd prepared for a worst-case scenario I'd hoped would never come, my daughter still had a home. People ask me sometimes, now that Emma's story has gotten around our community, whether I always knew Kevin was dangerous. The honest answer is no, I didn't know. But I suspected. Something about him had always felt slightly off to my forensic accountant's brain. The same instincts I'd honed over 43 years tracking down financial predators. I'd hoped I was wrong, hoped Emma would have a happy marriage and I'd be the paranoid mother-in-law who'd worried for nothing. But I wasn't wrong. And because I'd trusted those instincts and acted on them, my family was safe. Today, Thomas is 9 months old, pulling himself up on furniture and babbling away in that language only babies speak. Emma is thriving in her career, has started dating again carefully, with strong boundaries, and talks about maybe buying a second property as an investment once Thomas is older. She's thinking generationally now, the way I taught her to think. Planning not just for her own future but for her son's future, for the legacy she leave him, and me. At 74 years old, I'm busier than I've been since retirement. Emma calls me for advice on everything from Thomas's sleep schedule to investment strategies. My friends my age ask me for help reviewing legal documents before they make major decisions. I've become the grandmother everyone wishes they had, the one who doesn't just bake cookies and babysit, but who knows how to read a contract, spot a financial predator, and protect her family with both love and legal precision. I think about Thomas often, not my grandson, and what he'd think of how everything turned out. He'd be proud, I know, proud that I'd protected Emma exactly the way he'd asked me to. Proud that his name lived on in a grandson he'd never meet but who carried his legacy. Proud that at 74, his wife was still fighting for family with everything she had. Kevin will be released from prison when Thomas is about 6 years old. Emma has already discussed with her lawyer what happens then. The restraining order remains in place. Kevin will have to petition the court for any visitation rights. And given his criminal record and the documented abuse, that petition will face significant obstacles. By the time Kevin might possibly see his son, Thomas will be old enough to understand that the grandmother who protected his mother is the real hero of this story. I'm writing this down now. Almost a year after that Thursday when I found Emma crying on the sidewalk outside her own house. Because I want other grandmothers, other mothers to understand something crucial. Age doesn't make you powerless. Experience doesn't make you obsolete. And the instincts you've honed over 74 years of living are worth more than all the smooth talk and manipulation younger people might try. Kevin underestimated me because I was an elderly woman. His family dismissed me because I was just the old mother-in-law. They thought I'd be too out of touch, too weak, too irrelevant to fight back. That was their fatal mistake, because I'd spent 4 decades hunting financial criminals professionally. And when someone threatened my family, I brought every single one of those skills to bear. I documented everything, built an airtight case, and used the law as the weapon it was designed to be a protection for the vulnerable against the predatory. If you're reading this and you're in a situation like Emma was, isolated, controlled, being told you're crazy or dramatic, please know that you're not. Trust your instincts, document everything, and reach out to someone you trust who has the experience and resources to help you. It might be a parent, a friend, a professional advocate, but you don't have to fight alone. And if you're like me, a grandmother watching a child or grandchild in a dangerous situation, don't let anyone convince you that your age makes you powerless. You have decades of experience, wisdom, and knowledge that younger people don't possess. Use it. Fight for your family with every tool you have. Legal protections, financial documentation, strategic planning. These aren't signs of being unloving. They're signs of loving wisely. I bought my daughter a house 3 years ago and put it solely in her name. Kevin and his family thought that was a meaningless technicality, that marriage would override my careful planning. They were wrong. That single legal decision made when Emma was blissfully happy and I was hopefully paranoid saved her from financial ruin, homelessness, and possibly losing her child. At 74 years old, I've learned that the best inheritance you can leave your children isn't just money. It's teaching them to protect themselves legally, to trust their instincts, to understand that kindness must be balanced with strong boundaries. It's showing them that grandmothers aren't just for cookies and bedtime stories, we're also for building impenetrable legal fortresses around the people we love. Thomas sleeps peacefully in his nursery as I finish writing this, safe in the home I bought for his mother, protected by the legal structures I built, surrounded by the love of a family that fought for him before he was even born. And when he's old enough to understand, I'll tell him this story. I'll tell him about his mother's courage, his grandfather Thomas's wisdom, and what his grandmother did when parasites tried to destroy their family. I'll tell him that at any age, in any circumstance, you fight for the people you love. You fight smart, you fight legally, and you never, ever underestimate the power of an elderly woman who's had 74 years to learn exactly how the world works. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt powerless or been dismissed because of your age, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I always wonder how far these stories travel and how many families they might help. And please subscribe to this channel, because every grandmother has stories like mine. Stories of fighting for family, stories of wisdom earned through decades of living. These stories need to be told, and I promise to keep telling them as long as I have breath in my 74-year-old body. My name is Margaret Sullivan. I bought my daughter a house, and when parasites tried to steal it, I reminded them that you don't mess with a grandmother who spent 43 years hunting criminals for a living. Welcome to the family.